Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. I think Malcolm doesn't need introductions, but he's a professor at the engineering science. He kindly came in today to speak about the challenges with renewables, and we're really delighted to have him in our last event this time. Um, and yeah, it's going to be super interactive, but I'll leave it to Malcolm. Thanks, guys.
Great. Don't worry. It'll be fine. Okay, so I looked at me and I said, what am I going to talk about? And there's about a gazillion things I can talk about. So, but this one is basically just to focus on some key issues that I think are going to be challenging as we go forward, and also some routes forward, some ways around that. But also, I wanted to challenge you to think about, okay, how could you work it? So the first thing you want to do is pair up or work in a three. So it's just move closer to each other. And if you're online, you can just think on this. But I'm going to start off with a question. How long did it take to transition from a horse and carriage to automobiles in New York? So talk to the person next to you and give your idea. And if you're online, write it down on a piece of paper and see what you think. So is it 5 decades, 3 decades?
Probably other question probably if you count it from the 14th century, or is it 18th?
Right, you got 10 seconds left.
So I think in the 19th century we got cars. So how long before that we had cars?
Okay, and the answer is I'm not going to tell you yet. I'll come to it in a moment. I just want to say that this presentation is based not just on my thinking, but of my whole team, and it's been wonderful to have them with me and working with me, so they get a lot of the credit. So if there is something you don't like, you can blame me. If you think something's exciting, you can thank them. Right, so let's just go back to the question about horse and carriages and how am I going to work this out. So I did a sabbatical a number of years back in Canada, and I had a weekend where I got totally bored. And I knew that one of my good friends had done some work on how long it takes to do the transition, but they just gave the first photograph and the last one. I went to go and look up there's a National Archive of pictures, and there's a link in there if you can download the images, where they have pictures from the Easter parade in New York. Okay, and so this is a long-standing tradition where people would come along in their fancy vehicles and basically parade down the street, and some pictures would be taken. And it's kind of an interesting and useful resource, because what I then did is to say, okay, let's count the number of carriages that we've got down the road. And you can see there that there are 4 carriages and a total of 0 cars. Okay, so this is in 1899. And then we go 1900, a couple of years later, and you can see there's lots of carriages here. Okay, and I sat down, and you notice I was very bored. There were 53 of them, but there were 2 vehicles here. And what's interesting, that Tony Sieber, my friend, said there was 1 vehicle, but I found 2. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And so that says us that you now got something like 4% of the vehicles are automobiles. Then you go 1904, when I could get the next one, and you could see that 3 out of 28. And interestingly, this guy here turns out to be an electric vehicle. So in 1908, we actually had, 1904, we had electric vehicles on the road, okay, which is kind of interesting. One of the weird things, in 1908, there were more electric vehicles than internal combustion vehicles on the road, and then things changed. So 1906, we get 5% of vehicles, 1907, 27. And what's interesting here, 2 different photographs I managed to find for 1907, and both of them give you about the same number, just to show that actually this method, although it's really poor sampling, not exactly the most robust sampling, it actually gives you numbers that are not bad. 1909, 44, 1911, 90, 1913, 95. And so what we find is actually, if we plot these, we find that actually the transition happens remarkably fast. In the order of about, if you have a look here, it starts from about 1906. by 1912, the transition's almost done. So 6 or 7 years, we moved from horse and carriage to automobiles. So how does that compare to the number that you thought it would be? Faster or slower?
Very fast.
A lot faster. A lot faster. Okay. The other thing, just to one thing to remember though is that, remember I said this is where you came showed off your fancy new vehicle. So basically these were effectively representative of new sales. Okay, so it was represented. Look, if you look wider out, you'll see that vehicles were still, horse and carriages were still going on a few years later, but not much later. And what you can do is you can fit in. Come on, guys. We can fit a S-curve or a logic function to the data. And what's kind of interesting is that really early on, about 1880, Carl Benz worked out what an internal combustion engine is. In 1886, he turned that into a vehicle, so that's way beyond before we started here. This phase here, as you start to get the creep up phase, you get quite a lot of innovation going on. And what we find is there's something like between 20 and 40 motor car companies in New York. So lots of companies coming through. Then we go through the scale-up phase where we go through this linear phase. And what's interesting in 1908 is when the Model T Ford was launched. And so that was really the first mass production of vehicles. And by the time we get to the end here, in the consolidation phase, is that we consolidated from 20 or 30 companies down to about 4 or 5. So it's kind of interesting just to note the different phases as you go through this S-curve. I love the S-curve because it represents a dynamic system, a generalized dynamic system where the starting point is your growth rate is dependent on the amount of new widgets you've got coming on, and the deceleration rate is now dependent on 1 minus the number. So basically the number of old widgets that you have. So you can see the growth rate is decelerated. That's as you get through it. If you take the derivative of this, you'll get a classic bell curve, or something like a bell curve, and then you can translate it to say these are the early adopters, these are the kind of early majority, this is your majority, this is your late majority, and that's your laggards. So basically those two kind of tie into each other. And it's quite useful. I find this is really useful to find out, are we on a trend where we're actually going to switch the transition? And if you plot these, you can see whether you can, how fast that transition is going to be. I also did some things where I only took the first 3 or 4 years, and I noticed that the midway point, and that's basically where your crossover point is, where half of the vehicles is there. That changes only by 1 or 2 years compared to where if you had the whole data set. So what I find is that this is a very good way to actually predict really early on, when your numbers are really small, what's going to happen here. Normally people will give it exponential growth, and this is exponential growth, but the problem is you can't have continuous exponential growth, otherwise it's just going to run out. You just don't have enough space to do that. So let's have a look and see if we can apply the same ideas to the modern day transition from automobiles to EVs. This is data that came out about a month ago. These are the actual percentage of EV sales. And then you fit the S-curve, and notice when we get 50%. And this is global sales. So half of all global sales happen in 2026, which is a lot earlier than a lot of people are thinking. Most people will say 2030, 2035. But actually, it's 2026 when half of all global sales, if this continues to go through, that's what's going to happen. Now, remember, that's sales, not stock. So what you have to do is remember that you then got to integrate this over a number of years, and that will tell you what the total stock is going to do. And roughly, the lifetime for most vehicles is something between 10 and 15 years, depending where you are. So that means the actual transition point where the stock starts to kick over is probably going to be in like the late 2030s, and that's when half of all vehicles go on. But what's interesting to me is, if you looked at the midpoint of the curve where we went from the transition from from horse and carriage to automobiles, that was the time when the New York horse market closed. So it didn't close at the end of the transition, it closed here, because basically it was no longer financially viable to do things. People weren't buying horses because they didn't realize the transition was happening. And I think something very similar is going to happen is that as we start to go through here, when we get to here, you will not be able to sell your internal combustion vehicle. Okay, because people will realize it's not worthwhile having. So you'll see car dealerships no longer selling it. The other implication is that when you start to see this is on a global scale, so to give you a rough idea, the total global sales last year was about 70 million vehicles. That's roughly the amount of vehicles that are coming on. We've got about 800 million vehicles in the stock, hence the 10-year lifespan. What you can see is that when you start to getting something like a 10% inflection on the number of vehicles that are coming on the vehicle, coming onto the market, which use petrol, is the requirement for oil is going to start to decrease. And the oil market is very, very sensitive to the difference between supply and demand. And the demand starts to decrease. We can see that really going down. We saw this during the COVID era where actually oil went negative. And so I'm thinking is by the time we get to the mid-2025 to 2030s, oil price is going to come right down, probably to the order of $10 to $20 a barrel from where we are now. So that's kind of interesting. No, but my talk was not about cars. Yeah. By the way, yeah, please ask. Okay, no. Don't ask questions.
Oh.
Your challenge is to ask so many questions that I don't get to the end of the slide deck by the time that I'm finished. So go for it, man. What's the question?
But like with the oil price drops, wouldn't that induce people who already have gasoline cars to drive more and to, utilize that cheap gas to, compete with?
Yeah, but the problem is that by the time we get to here, okay, let me go back one second. Cars are largely bought not on the utility, but the way I describe them is male jewelry. It's basically to show off your status. Do you want to be driving around in an old style vehicle? Okay, so this is why the Teslas basically show that actually that's become an aspirational thing. So yes, those who are left behind, those who haven't transitioned may well travel more distances, longer distances, or go back to the distance they're traveling. But actually, the societal pressure for you to change is going to be so strong that actually you will that will start to compensate for that decrease in cost, because it's not cost that drives the what we find is that the amount of miles driven is very inelastic with petrol price. Yeah, it doesn't change very much with petrol price.
Yeah. I have a small comment with regards to supply and demand in oil, although it might not be connected, but if the demand for oil starts to drop, that means there's going to be less suppliers because they cannot afford
exactly
the extraction cost.
Right, so that means it's going to price out the more expensive suppliers are going to start to decrease. And what you'll find is that people like Saudi Arabia, where it's really cheap to grab the oil out, will start to win. But you'll find that the very expensive places will then start to close down. And the more interesting one is not necessarily the oil supply, but what about the oil refineries? Because a lot of them are on a marginal cost basis, so they're going to start closing down. Yeah. Sorry, the back here.
Yeah, my question is now as the EVs increase, right? It also means an increase in the electricity demand. So
yes,
what is the consideration in that space in terms of the existing grids? What then happens to them?
Yeah, exactly. They're going to get stressed, and I know you're from Namibia, but I know next door South Africa, where they got 10-hour rolling blackouts at the moment. It's going to be a real problem. And actually, one of the issues I don't talk about, but is really live, is to say the transition to electricity for things like in the mobility sector is actually going to put a lot of stresses on the power system. And it's not just South Africa; it's everywhere it's going to have it. And so one of the issues is to say, we know that in the timescales we have to transition, we can't actually get the grid going fast enough to transition fast enough, and that's going to be a real headache over the next 10 years. Yeah, we already started to see it. For instance, in December was the first time where people driving Teslas in the UK had to wait up to 3 hours for charging because there weren't enough chargers on the network. So we're already starting to see that pressure coming through. Yeah.
You mentioned that at the start of the transition with the horse and carriage to car in New York,
there's loads of manufacturers and it ends up being 4 at the end.
Yes.
How should we, as like governments, rate like society and investors, invest in manufacturers? Or was the answer just back to the right course?
Well, buy yourself a TARDIS. So time machine, go and have a look at the end. Yeah. Look, you can't. It's not always clear who the winner's going to be. Okay, at this stage, because at this stage it looked like Ford almost went bankrupt. Okay, but then he changed his process and he got through. It's the way I would say it is look for the people whose vision is they want to get up here, not that they want to get up to there. So who's looking at scale? Who's looking at doing massive scale really rapidly? Those are the guys that are probably going to win. You've got to be a little bit careful because do you remember in Oxford we had all the bicycles? Everybody had, and there was three different companies all trying to do things, and billions of dollars were done because they were trying to scale too quickly. And so the problem is they hadn't found out the market fit first, and then you've got to find out, does your product actually meet the market's needs? Yes, then you scale. Yeah. So if you look in, the Koenig execs of this world are not going to be up here in the scale. Yeah. Yeah.
What I find interesting with this conversation about EVs and then the power grids is, I think with the increasing pressure on the power grids,
yeah,
it eventually makes it difficult for the power systems to be transformed to renewable energy.
Correct. Okay, so you're absolutely right. And one of the biggest problems I've identified in the power sector changing is not the technology, it's not the finance, it's the mindset of the people working in that industry. Because if you think about it, it's an industry that's hardly changed since the 1950s, has really just wanted to keep the lights on, very standard, very process-driven. Yeah? Nothing's much changed. If anything, the load's gone down over the last 10 years because of LEDs and stuff like that. So it's all the people in the power system are there to say, well, it's very easy for me to just move on to the next, just to keep on doing what I'm doing. And suddenly this comes along and says, oh dear, we can have some real problems. So they're going to have to do a mindset think. And this is what's great for you guys, because you're not locked into that way of thinking and you can kind of reimagine what that network needs to be. Yeah. And so one of the great things is that I think as we get younger people coming into the system that are not in there just to do the same thing every day, but rather to be innovative and to try and do something differently, they can help that power system change. But you can't do it in the old ways of thinking because it just doesn't work anymore.
It's kind of a note, Mark. So you mentioned the power system needs to transition quickly in order to keep up with the demand.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on that later on.
Oh, okay, perfect. My question is, wouldn't that, if you're coming later on, that's perfect, but wouldn't that, in order for your utilities to keep up, it might need to invest in more dispatchable?
Oh, okay, I've got a whole thing on that. Let me come back to that later. Yeah, you're right. Okay. All right, so I'm talking about renewables. Okay, so what I did is I went to BP and they do the annual review of energy and they give all the data from 1965 to 2021. And this is basically the ratio of renewables, and the ones I've selected here are wind, solar, and geo and bio. Those are the ones that I've taken. So I've not taken nuclear and I've not taken hydro. Okay, and I'll talk in a moment why I haven't taken those. But if you have a look here, again, you can see it's fitting quite nicely. But look, when your transition is 2045, only 50%, and by the time we get to kind of 2080 is when we're starting to get to place, which is way too late. This is why I'm saying is that this is what my purpose of the talk is to say, how can we move this way? How do we do that? Two reasons. Okay, so a couple of things are why didn't I include hydro and why didn't I include nuclear? Main reason is a lot of the hydro was actually done in the 50s and 60s, and most of the good sites have already been taken. And so we've kind of, they went through a nice S curve, but they've kind of almost reached the end point there. There is some in Africa, there are a few sites left where you can put some large dams, and there's some micro hydro that we can put in. But hydro is basically there's no huge places where you can make a big difference. Same thing with nuclear. Nuclear also kind of maxed out in the 70s and 80s, and now it's going to have to refresh. So if you include those, you'll see it starts to bump here, and there's a little, but basically only starts to transition up here. So this is all the new renewables coming in. So talk to your person next to you and say, why do you think it's so slow? What are 2 good reasons that you think? I'm going to give you 4, but I want you to think through what are 2 good reasons. Again, give you 2 minutes. Go. 1 minute, actually.
Yeah. I think it's a question of why the variables are being slow. I think one, especially so like that's why we only notice like recently we have 2010 and 2020. So if we pick the same speed, it can be accelerated.
Okay, so I think there are about 5 or 6 different reasons, 4 reasons that things are going slowly, but I'm going to just pick up on 3. Oh, but yeah, before I carry on. So one interesting thing with this is this includes the total energy consumed and includes the kind of primary energy from coal and oil and gas. But whereas renewables is all measured in the electrical output. Okay, and we know that the conversion from oil and gas to electricity is going to be about, if you're lucky, 50%. So what happens is if you take the same curve and you just say, okay, the effective exergy that you've got available, you actually go slightly quicker. Okay, so if you say this is the effective renewable amount of energy that we need to do to replace those same services, we do go slightly quicker, but it's still slow. So why so slow? So I'm going to pick up on 3 particular ones, and on my slides, and I'll mention a 4th. But how many of you had land use as part of your problems? One of you? Anybody had the variability of supply and demand? Yeah. Markets?
In my masters.
What other cool? Just shout out any other things. What are some of the big things? Go on in the back. Reliability, yeah, good one. Yeah.
I think we mentioned incentives, especially in the beginning.
Incentives, yeah. Any other thoughts? Mindset, yes. John, any thoughts? I'm going to pick on you, or you two. Policy, yeah. That's all part of the thing. So I'm going to start with land use because that's not normally the most obvious ones, but there's something that fundamentally changes. And that is we're changing from a stock of energy. It's basically the amount of gas or amount of coal that we have. And we used to extract from a stock. We're now harvesting a flux. Okay, so it's a flow of materials so it's a flow of energy we're now intersecting to do that. And the problem is the fuel is lovely and is very energy dense. So you don't need much land to actually deal with it. But our flows are quite small, so that we need to have much larger land area to actually do stuff. So to give you an idea, you can see there's France there and Germany and a few others. That is about the land area we need if you wanted to power everything off solar. Okay, so just to give you a rough idea, it's about 475 kilometers by 475 kilometers is the rough area that we need in France to be able to do. Obviously, if you put it in the middle of the Sahara, we need slightly less. Okay, but that gives you a rough area. Now, you think, oh, that's not very much. Except if you happen to live there, I don't think you'd be very happy to say, right, sorry guys, we'll bulldoze you all out and then put solar fields on there, yeah? But that's what's happening. Okay, it's not land that's been sacrificed, but it's actually farming land that's been sacrificed. That's been a lot of the issues. And so one of the big things is to say, how do we manage that land? How do we manage the use of land so that we can do something more, so that we don't lose out on the farming side of things? So this is actually quite an active area of research, and I've done some work on it as well. Ooh. What happened? Didn't like it. Okay. So what you can see is, if you have a look here, you notice that the solar panels aren't. There's two interesting things about them. One is they're high, and the second thing is they're spaced apart. Now, talk to the person next to you. Why is high useful? Okay, go on. Okay.
Each other.
Okay, so one part of the question is actually in the pictures. What's this? Yeah, you got to get a tractor underneath them. Okay, and if you're doing things like wheat, you got to get a combine harvester underneath them. Okay, so you need to have them high. Okay, which makes it more expensive. Okay, but what's the other thing that happens? If you think about it, let me just give you a little online demonstration. If you look at that, if I put it very close, where's my shadow? It's very close to that. But if I put it far away, actually my shadow moves with the sun. So that means that you don't have the same piece of land under shadow the whole time. And you can actually mathematically design your array so that you can actually say how much sunlight is actually on the land, and you can actually tailor your design of your solar plant so that you can do that. Now, I did a final year last year, and he showed that, and he built a crop model in as well, is that in the UK, it was for Devon, for an acre of land, you could get 80% of the energy compared to if you used a conventional design layout, compared to the one where you lift them up and you spread them out a little bit more. You get 80% of the energy, but you also get 80% of the crop. And that's not a bad one now, because it now means that your land can be used for both crops and for this. What's interesting in these guys, this is wine. These are vineyards. And actually, they need the shading in hot areas so they don't burn it. So it actually makes land more productive. Okay, which is I think that's kind of cute. Okay. And then also, you can obviously, with wind turbines, you can do quite a lot with wind turbines. I just happen to show you've got cows in there. This is interesting. You can just about see it if you have a look here. This is actually a very large irrigation channel. Okay. And what they've done is they've put solar over the irrigation channel, and they've actually got it so it actually sits on the water. It floats and sits on the water. And what they found is they lose about 40% less water because you've got the solar on. So you actually get a double win. So what this is trying to say is that, yes, land is a problem, but if you think in a different way, you can get up some really creative solutions where you actually get multiple wins. Okay, and this is what I'm trying to say, is that you can start to do that. Any questions? Great. Okay, so that's going to be my land use one, and basically say that you do need quite a lot of land, but and it's not all going to be in Germany. It is going to be distributed around the world, but yeah.
What do you think about offshore options?
Yeah, so if you've got a continental shelf which is not too deep, you can do offshore wind relatively straightforwardly. You can do 0 to about 60, 70 meters with a foundation, and then from about 200 beyond 200 meters, you can do floating. There's this kind of zone between 100 and 200 meters, which is very difficult to do.
What I found interesting, especially for offshore wind, is the capacity factor is higher.
Yes, because you don't have roughness, so therefore the wind blows a lot better. But it can look ugly. Yeah.
Why is it an issue, between 100 and 200 meters?
Okay, because if you go beyond 100 meters, if you're trying to do a foundation, that's a bloody long pole.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why couldn't we do floating?
Okay, because what happens, you have guy ropes that go down and they have to follow a catenary reaction, and you don't have long enough for the catenary reaction.
Like a train.
Yeah, exactly. So what you do now have to do is add extra bits into it, and then you get problems.
Right.
Just one of those little fun facts. Okay. So the second problem is a variable. Okay, and then I'm sure you all talked about temporal variability, and I'm actually going to talk about spatial variability. So what you can say is that it depends where you are in the world. This is solar. You can see the redder the amount, the more energy, or the greater the flux is, so you can get more energy per unit area, and so the better you can get. And so you can see that if you happen to be in Namibia, happy days, in South America, Australia, Saudi, all happy days. There's lots of solar sitting there, and you can start to do that. But the problem is, where are most of the loads? Well, most of the loads are kind of like over here, over there, over here. Okay, so that means there's a disparity between where the generation is and where the load's going to be. So it means we're going to have to move energy through space. But hey, we know what a power line looks like. We can kind of start to do that. If you look, this is what wind is looking like, and so this is the different wind resource, and you can see here off the coast, like you said earlier on, is to say that's where actually quite a lot of good wind density is. You get getting higher capacity factors off the coast. Now, what's kind of useful is to say as well is to say that if you look at those two pictures, there are several places where, for instance, it's really good for sun but not for wind, or good for wind and not good for sun. So the variability is also the variability in the flux that you're actually accessing. You know, is it wind? Is it solar? Is it geothermal? And each of those gives you some different options to do. And there's a wonderful article in the FT 2 days ago, which basically said that if you combine the two, if you can combine the two of them, you actually get a much better temporal variation as well. So your time variation of the two is much better, which means you need much less storage. So energy is distributed around the world. Load is in different places in the world. What we're going to do about it? So that's a picture of a combination of about 8 or 9 different proposals on how you can start to get long-distance DC grids going. And this shows how you can actually connect up the different parts of the world. We already know that there's some interesting stuff going from here across to Singapore. That's starting to get through. China's supergrid is largely done because a lot of their wind is over here and their load is over there. That's starting growing. Desert Tech was a great thing earlier on, and then the Arab Spring came along and realized that the political challenges were quite good, were quite challenging. The Nordic grid is busy being built at the moment because Norway has a lot of large hydro, which they can use as batteries. So that's being built. There's you might have heard of the IRA. Who's heard of the IRA and not the Irish? Okay, but it's the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, where $400 billion is going into renewable energy, and quite a lot part of that is actually going into building this grid across the US, because bizarrely the US has not got a strong interconnection between, they've got about 4 different grids which operate more or less independently with each other. We're also showing some work where actually Mexico can be quite a good producer, which can come up there. So the idea is that we can now start to think about how we can move energy around because generation is distributed. Go and talk to your person next to you and say, what is the one problem with this? And I kind of hinted it already.
We were going to supply to
Right, so I think I've heard the word already, but let's go through it. So technically feasible. Economically, actually, if we really genuinely did this, it would probably decrease the end price of electricity by about 20 to 30%. Okay, so if you looked at the population weighted cost of that. So it sounds like a good thing, but somebody mentioned the word politics. Yeah, so because remember I said, why did Desert Tech fail? Arab Spring. Okay, why don't we want to go through here at the moment? Russia. Yeah. So politics kind of gets in the way, and actually politics are even trying to do that bit is proving to be almost impossible because people say, well, I don't want a power line going through past here. Okay, so that produces a huge amount of local politics, which then prevents a lot of these lines being built. So whenever you hear people saying, "Oh, we can just build a big line," just have a little amber flag waving to say actually building lines and building transmission is great, except for politics, and politics always gets in the way. So what this picture shows is some work I've been doing with one of my past students, Constance. This here is a snapshot of the world, and you can see it's either in February or in July, 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock at night, all in GMT. Okay, you can see the day-night curve coming in there, and you can see the load, and this is now the load of each country, and it's normalized to its maximum. So you can see, for instance, here in February, let's go up. Let's go here. We can say in February, this is July. We can see there's a lot of load in the US. Why? Air conditioning, absolutely. Whereas in the winter, not much at all. Okay, but you can also then see the difference between day and night, and you can see what the differences are there. So what this is showing is that actually we have temporal variations both on a diurnal scale as well as a seasonal scale, and what I didn't get to show you here, and a decadal scale. So over the length spans of a decade, you also get massive changes. Okay, so for instance, 2 decades ago, you would have a huge, there'd be a huge spike because we had a lot of winter electric heating, direct electric heating in the UK. That's all starting to disappear as people start to get rid of their storage heaters. So things are changing, okay, over the decades. So now the question is, and we also know, how much solar are we going to get now? Well, not a little bit, 1% or less than 1%. So we also know that the renewables have a problem with temporal variation. Again, also on those 3 length scales, diurnally, seasonally, and over the decades. So what does that do to our power system? So we've got our wonderful power system, lots of renewables coming up here, lots of electrical nodes, moving lots of energy through space. But as somebody also mentioned, what we have to do is we've got to think about moving energy through time as well. Okay, so we've got to move energy through both space and time. So I always think about that the energy systems are going to become like Doctor Who. Okay, so it's going to do that. And the way we move through energy through time is 2 different ways. One is through direct storage, so that could be batteries or pumped hydro, or it could be a change in your service. So basically you say, okay, I'm not going to use my heat pump at this time. I'm going to delay that service later on because my energy is being stored in the home. Or it could be, I'm in a place where there's not much water, so I'm basically using electricity to make water. And you can say, right, I'll rather store the water because that's much cheaper than storing a battery. Okay, so there are different ways of doing it. But also what you start doing to find is that you also need a lot more data flows because you need to really start to understand what's happening in your system a lot better than you had earlier on, because these are expensive and lumps of coal is cheap to do your storage. Okay. Everybody happy so far? Okay. Right, so that's how we start to deal with variability. In fact, I just want to say, if you want to think, this is the space where you've got to really think a lot very differently. And there's lots and lots of opportunities in this space. Because it's not something, if you speak to a power engineer 20 years ago, they would not even have thought about that they actually move energy through space. So here's a huge amount of hundreds and thousands of PhDs are sitting in here, lots of spin-outs are sitting in there, lots of value to be created are sitting out there. I'm going to deal with my last one, which is markets. So one of the drivers behind any transition is to say that it's got to be financially viable and it's got to be worthwhile and worth thinking through it. And one of the problems that we have at the moment is that we've got a market if you look globally at all the different markets, they are largely set up for buying energy where your operational cost is really high. In other words, you're putting fuel into the system, and so your operational cost is high. Whereas we're moving to a world where whether you take 1 kilowatt or 2 kilowatt out of a 10 kilowatt solar panel, the difference between those is zero. So your what we call the short run marginal cost is zero. Short run means I've got the panel and I'm just looking how much energy you take out of it. Classic example of this and how the thinking really gets one is I was doing some field work in Kenya looking at different solar grids, and we went to this wonderful place where they had some nice solar panels up and they had a big office, and in the office was a huge 70-inch TV going full on, and there's nobody there. And all of us energy guys are saying, tut, 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 this is really wasteful. This is why we're doing, this is crazy. Why they're wasting all this energy? And later on, we worked out, we went around, we eventually met the guys who were there and operating it, went around, saw the batteries were full, there was no load, so the energy wasn't being wasted. There was no use for it, okay? So that kind of shows you that's the whole, in a zero marginal cost world, efficiency can be less important if you've got excess. If you don't have excess, then the efficiency is very important. So long run marginal cost, what's the short run and long run? Short run, we said, is operational. Long run marginal cost means I now need to buy another panel in order to supply an increased load. Okay, and so that's my long run marginal cost, which is basically the capital. So the first thing that we got to do is think about, I am proposing 4 kind of archetypes of markets, and real markets will be a blend of these. But but you need to cover all 4 of these, otherwise you're in trouble. So the first one is to say it's a market purely for generation. And generation basically is you need to pay for these guys. So you've got to cover the long run marginal cost of your generation. The way you do that is not paying per hour, because that and changing the hourly rate, that really gives a lot of uncertainty and a high lot of risk to people making investment into these. So what you do there is you make sure you produce a long-term contract. That it can either be you bid into a concession to run your field, and then you get paid per megawatt hour that you come out at a fixed rate, or one of the interesting models is that you can actually rent the space on a wind farm. So what you do is you say, okay, I'm going to rent 10% of that capacity, and that's the way you do it. There are different ways of doing that. So that gets your long-term, ensures that you can cover off your risk. The problem is if I rent my capacity of from a wind farm, the guy says, thank you very much, I'm going to take my $100,000 every month, but I'm not going to maintain my wind turbines. Okay, so what you need to ensure is that there is good maintenance going on, so that otherwise that model goes down. And the way of thinking it is a bit like if you're leasing a car, is there's often a maintenance contract that goes alongside it to ensure that that car is actually producing what you want it to do.
Malcolm, can you mention the case of Scotland and their contracts with wind farms?
So they do this through CFDs. So what they do is a contract for difference, which basically says that they will guarantee a price no matter what the market's doing. And this is a classic fudge where you're trying to make this happen in a market which is not designed for it. And so what happened is that, as you know, that the prices went really high, but the CFD price, the strike price, was much lower. So basically a lot of the money went back to the government, and the government made a lot of money out of it. But they don't tell you that they made the money. Yeah.
So with the CFDs, is that per like megawatt?
Yeah.
Produced?
Per megawatt hour. Yeah.
So it's still an incentive to maintain the turbines well and produce as much as you can.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's one way of incentivizing it. The problem with the leasing model is that you're not paying them per megawatt hour that's coming out. So therefore, that's the case where what you then do is you put a service level agreement alongside that and says if you're not producing X amount, you get penalized. Yeah. So there's 2 ways of skinning the same cat. The second market is basically to look at what is the predictable temporal imbalance that you have. The key, so we know that over time, with solar, that you can have different variations. This is going to be, say, for instance, different loads and under different whether you've got a particular temperature coming through. So you can say, okay, I'll be the black in a low temperature, and I'll be the yellow in a high temperature. So that means that I can now predict ahead of time what my load's going to be, and you can predict ahead of time what your generation is going to be, and basically you set up a balancing market. And this is relatively straightforward. We do this in the UK, where we balance every half hour. What's interesting in Australia, they balance every 5 minutes. So it's a much faster time frame. And actually, when they balanced it, they have to predict within that every 4 seconds what they're going to be producing. Okay, so again, wonderful opportunities here, because now forecasting becomes extremely valuable. Forecasting equals machine learning or whatever. So again, if you've got all that side of things, you can really start to create a lot of value in that space. The question is, okay, so here you're going 1 to 5 minutes. What happens when somebody pulls a switch they shouldn't have, and or a cloud comes along that you didn't predict well? So you now have uncertainty, you have unpredictable events. How do you manage those? So what you could do is you basically make sure that you've got some storage that can cover you over those shorter time intervals. Basically, it's a standby, so that storage has got to be in standby all the time, and it's almost like a service play that we had earlier on. And we can see that these two can, the markets 2 and 3 can interact with each other, and there'll be crossovers because, okay, so 1 minute it covers there, but what happens in the next minute and the following minute, and how do we change the predictions and all that type of thing. But that unpredictable one is going to be really important. Now, there's no market at the moment which deals with unpredictability, not in the way that we're looking at. And then the fourth market is what happens when something goes horribly wrong. Okay, and you think, oh, that's not going to happen. Well, in Texas, 2 years ago, we had extremely cold temperatures, which were unexpected, and basically about 30% of the generation was frozen, and the wind turbines were frozen, and they couldn't produce the energy. So there's a term called value of lost load, which basically says how valuable is it if you lose a load. And if that is much higher than your market cap can be, which most markets will have a cap, but it's much higher, then there's no way of actually maintaining your energy system. So what often happens is you can start to create an insurance premium where somebody will come alongside and put it in for you. Now you might think, where does this happen? Well, if you think of things like standby diesel units on hospitals and banks, is effectively a way of doing an insurance mechanism. But there's not quite a lot of thinking about saying, how do you actually do this on a much bigger scale? Because this is going to be an ever-increasing problem as we go forward, because a lot of services are starting to move to electricity. And if electricity fails, it's going to have a much bigger impact than it had in the past. So this market, I think, is one of the really interesting ones to watch. So, last slide. What can you contribute? Okay, I've talked about some of my issues and some of my thinking, but you guys are all part of the Oxford Energy Society. So one of the things you might be thinking is, so how can I contribute in this? What can I do? I just wanted to give you this little quote, is to say, when systems have been around for a long time, you need a lot of specialism to get any value, which basically means lots of training, lots of working around that. But when the systems are undergoing rapid change, remember we've got our TARDIS element coming in, space and time, then we need some really, I would say, innovative and broad understanding to actually understand where the new value is going to come from. And that will then give you an incentive to actually start to say, okay, how do I start to make a living out of this, either through research or through doing spin-outs. And that's me done. You didn't succeed. Almost, but not quite. Any final questions? Anything? Yeah.
What are the challenges with distributed generation? So if everybody has solar panels on their houses, because part of the problem getting electricity down is the big cables at the front, but if that's all, getting from me to my neighbor is much easier.
Right. So the biggest problem is that normally if you've got a generator and then a load and the load and load and the houses with the lines going down, is your voltage goes down all the time. Okay, and everything's designed for that. When you start putting generation, actually your voltage can start to, as you go down, it actually gets higher and higher and higher. Okay, so your voltage limits start to get violated, and that means things start going bang. Okay, because your voltage is getting too high, and so managing that is quite difficult. There is a secondary problem, which is a lot of the protection systems in the distribution system assume that power is flowing in one direction. And so when it says negative flow, they say minus flow, I don't care, I'm happy. But the magnitude is still large enough to actually cause a problem. So those are the two big issues that you've got to really worry about is increasing voltage and how does the protection system work with it.
And is that more a case of changing some of the infrastructure or the control mechanisms because the system's not behaving as it was originally designed? Absolutely,
and in fact, we head up a thing called the International Community Local Smart Grids, which means one Wednesday every month we come together and we talk. So we is 10 utilities around the world, okay? And we're finding that TEPCO in Japan and Ausgrid in Sydney are having this problem big time, and they're really struggling to say, how do we actually manage it? And somebody mentioned policy being part of the problem, and that is that the DNOs, the people on the lines, don't have any policy, any regulatory mechanisms to control the voltage coming out yet. So they're not looking to say two things. One is, can they start to control the inverters and limit the amount of energy they're actually supplying? That's option one. Or secondly, can they incentivize other loads to come out at the same time to use it locally? And that's what we're doing in Oxfordshire, is we want to set up a local market so that when voltages start, when there's excess generation, the local people use it so it doesn't affect the rest of the grid negatively. Yeah, but again, it's a completely different mindset. And the question then is to say, well, do you really want to be sitting on your iPhone, on your app saying, okay, I'm going to trade with my neighbor tomorrow, or no? You're not going to want to do that because you'll get, it's 25p, yay! Okay, So what you're looking to say, how do you create automated systems to be able to do that? When you start doing that, is what is the communication system? What are the protocols? How do you make sure it's all compatible? How do you make sure that the port water doesn't hit the fan? And work that out. And again, we're doing quite a lot of work in reinforcement learning to say, actually, how would you actually run agents that would then operate that in a sensible way and maintain the system well without breaking it? Yeah, lots of fun. Good question. Yeah.
Is 100% renewable generation going to happen? And if so, is it on what sort of time frame?
Okay, let me ask you, what do you mean by renewable?
As in, include nuclear, but just non-fossil generation for all of our energy.
Can it happen? Yes. Will it happen? Yes. When will it happen? That's the hard question. So if I come back to here, I think we will get to here relatively easily. This last bit is going to be really tough. Yeah. So I think we'll get there okay. And then the question is, do you need the direct air capture and all those carbon offsetting stuff to kick in or not? I would hope we don't, because trying to fix up your tailpipe emissions is always worse than rather to stop the emissions in the first place. I'm hoping by the time we get to here that some really innovative stuff will come in, so this looks easy. Yeah. But my question is, first of all, how do we make that ramp steeper? Yeah.
I have a question about S-curve. So you mentioned the transition a lot.
Yeah.
Do you believe in the concept of bridging fuels such as gas, carbon capture and storage, or other dispatchable way of generating before we eventually reach a solar wonder world?
Okay, so would I prefer the US to be burning gas rather than coal? Yes, because that's what we did here. Would I want them burning gas in 2050, 2060? No. So that means that I would say, yeah, go to gas, that's fine, but only expect a 10 to 15-year lifespan. And that then constrains the transition. So make sure your business case is solid for 2050. If you're here and this actually does go a lot steeper, your investment is a massive risk because you're going to have it stranded. That's the problem with it. So what's interesting, I know a lot of the oil majors are now saying any investment in oil must be fully paid back within 7 years.
The payback is
It's 7 years, and in gas, it's now 10 years. Whereas when 3 years ago, those were both 20 years. So people are starting to recognize this is going there, and the question is, if it starts to go steeper, your bets become really expensive and really start hurting. Yeah. Yes.
Do you expect those numbers to go down, as in 20 years, in 3 years went down to 7 years? Do you think in 2 years it will be like no new oil will be getting built? Or?
Well, we're already starting to see. Okay, okay. What happened last year that screwed the energy system up big time?
Russia invaded Ukraine.
And what's that? Politics.
Yeah.
Okay, so politics can really mess things up quite badly. So the question is, if you take politics off the as in major political events like that, sort of like Black Swan type events, then I think, yes, we will go quicker than we're going now. And I think we will start to really sort of drive stuff. What's really interesting is that we started to see quite a lot of the large fossil fuel companies recognize that they have to start changing. And when they start applying their large capital assets into the space, you'll start to see that really start accelerating, I think.
There's a question in the chat
Yeah.
saying, how can we facilitate the mindset change?
I'm doing it now. And you got to do it with your peers. You know, you've got to I mean, remember this curve here, hold on, that one did a mindset change for me to show that the transition can actually happen a lot quicker than you expect it to be. And when you recognize that, actually it shows that there's opportunity and you can start to do things and you can start to think differently. The other thing that you can do is always challenge your assumptions. We have a whole lot of assumptions that are embedded in us. So for instance, one of them is to say, and Andres knows this one, is to say, okay, power is proportional to frequency. Okay, that's a well-known assumption, and it's not true. So the question is, if you start challenging those really fundamental assumptions, you can then start to think of innovative ways. You know, the other assumption was, when you put PV down, you can't do agriculture. That's not true. If you do PV the way that everybody else does it, yes, you can't do agriculture. But if you think about it, yes, you can do it. Yeah. Yes, fine. And last one, and I'm going to disappear.
Okay, this is more about my research then. Like, we know that battery is more for short-term storage because it's the pricing of it is just too expensive for long-term storage.
Yeah.
But what do you think is some of the more prominent technology that's going to come up to fill the gap of long-term storage?
I'll answer it by saying you don't need long-term storage.
Why do we?
Okay.
Yeah.
Remember I said, if you look at the power system, it's about space and time. And there's a big reason why I use the word and. Because what you can do is use spatial variation to overcome temporal storage. So why would you invest in a lot of expensive storage when you can actually buy from somewhere else in the world that's being produced there and then at a much cheaper cost? Yeah?
Yeah.
You only need storage if you think of if you think as an island that this is the only place. If you think in the globe, you don't need storage.
Do you think market would take care of more of the long term?
And the one that I would, if you look at my market one, it's basically market 2. That one. Because this means that if I can predict now a month ahead what I'm going to do, I might buy some ammonia produced in Chile that I can land on my shores here to be able to put into my power system and to do that. Yeah? Rather than having something, the ammonia that I saw from last year. Yeah? Okay. Cool.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys.
Let's take that she will, she's our secretary.
Great.
Amazing.
All right.
Yeah, that's cool.
So you all guys are going to go and have a wonderful time on Friday when you got to leave end of term.
That was really amazing.
That's really interesting.
Do you want to
Yeah,
stop that?
Hello, Professor.
Hi, Malcolm. Yeah.